Welcome to episode 12 of Quiltside Chats. Brought to you by American Quilt Study Group. The American Quilt Study Group establishes and promotes the highest standards for interdisciplinary quilt-related studies, providing opportunities for study, research, and the publication of works that advance the knowledge of quilts and related subjects. In partnership with the International Quilt Museum at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The International Quilt Museum's mission is to build a global collection and audience that celebrate the cultural and artistic significance of quilts. Quiltside Chats are a series of lively conversations between Caroline Ducey, International Quilt Museum Curator of Collections, and an American Quilt Study Group member featuring the quilt that she or he would sneak out of the building if it weren't a crime. Lori Lee Triplett has written more than 16 books and numerous magazine articles. Her most recent book, written with her sister Kay Triplett, Hidden Treasures, Quilts from 1600 to 1860, was awarded the H. Mark Dunn Research Grant and the Lucy Hilty Research Grant. Her book, Pioneer Quilts, examines the Great Western Migration of the pioneers. Indigo Quilts, which covers the history of indigo from Africa to America, received the Lucy Hilty Research Grant and the Meredith Scholar Award. She also co-authored the successful Chintz Quilts from the Poos collection with Kay Triplett and Xenia Cord. She is a member of the American Quilt Study Group, American Quilters Society, Heartland Quilt Network, the International Quilt Study Center and Museum, the Modern Quilt Guild, and SAQUA, Studio Art Quilts Associates. She holds an MA in theater and a law degree from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She is also an art quilter, and her work can be found in private and corporate collections, museums, and the Arts Alliance gift shop. And now, let's cozy up to the quilt.
Hi, Lori. Welcome.
Hi.
This is going to be such a fun chat. We both love chintz so much, and we both have been studying it for a long time.
Yes, we have.
You more than I have recently. I have kind of moved on from that general topic, but I think you've gotten me all enthused to get back to it after we were just at the seminar, and I attended your study session, and that was really fun to have all those memories of those beautiful chintz quilts. So you've picked out a really beautiful quilt for us to look at today. But before we get started, first of all, we were so thrilled. So here's the beautiful manifesto that you wrote on chintz quilts and their history. We cut off the audio. Tara, can you hear me?
Only on your...
No?
It was only on the slide on the recording. You're fine now. You're on the audio fine.
Okay, good. Good. Anyway, so we're here and we're talking with Lori, and I wanted to mention how thrilled we are that the chintz collection from this wonderful book is now a part of the International Quilt Museum's collection, and it was really just a thrill. I just can't tell you how much that meant to me to have your amazing collection come to the museum. So before we get started on the Danby quilt, tell us a little bit more about the Poos collection.
The Poos collection is one of the largest privately held quilt and textile collections in the world, and we named it after our grandmother, Martha Poos, who taught us to quilt and actually inspired the love of quilts in Kay. It took me a little bit longer, and I give Kay credit for inspiring the love of quilts in me. And so the Poos collection, although it's named for our grandmother, it was not assembled by our grandmother, but was really assembled by Kay. We do have a few quilts of our grandmother's in the collection, but she was in the double knit phase. And so those are not ones that we usually take out for presentations. And sadly, those are pretty indestructible, so they may survive longer than some of the other beauties in the collection.
The irony.
Yeah.
Well, it is an amazing collection, and the research that you and Kay have done has just been incredible. And what a gift to all quilters and quilt historians and just the world in general that you've had this amazing career in research, all these different topics. So, but let's get to which quilt you would steal if it weren't a crime. And this is just, I mean, this just makes my heart sing to see this beautiful chintz applique. So go ahead and tell us what you know about this quilt.
Well, first of all, I would say that out of all the quilts, when we delivered them to IQM, you asked us if there was one quilt we wanted to look at one last time. And of course, this was the quilt that we got out so that we could say goodbye to it. It is an amazing treasure. And at first, it almost looks like it's a whole cloth until you realize that someone actually cut out and applied very skillfully these different fabrics to it to create its own fabric. Now, the border that goes around the outside is fabric, not more of her applique, but the inside, that border, the work is just amazing. And when it was in an exhibition in France, when we launched the book, we really had a hard time convincing people not to touch it because it's just so instinctive that you can't see stitches and you just want to reach out and really see that, oh my gosh, that's stitched on. And so that was a real struggle.
It's such a beautiful quilt, and you kind of forget yourself for a minute when you look at it, and you really do, because of the way she did the applique so closely. You just think that can't be appliqued on. And so you really do want to get up there and kind of poke around at it a little bit.
Yeah, and see how much of it is applique. And then you realize, well, it's all applique. And so she was a very skilled artisan, and such a skilled artisan that she in fact made two. And if we can go to the next slide, you will see that there were two quilts. They're not exactly alike. They are companion. And they were up for auction at Christie's auction in 2008. And I'm going to read what the auction statement was, just so that we all have the same starting place for it. And these were made up for her hope chest. They instead were packed away when Miss Danby of Parker's Peace, Cambridge, sadly never married, and so never used the quilts. They therefore retain all the freshness of their original color, including the often fugitive greens. Densely packed with printed chintz motifs, carefully cut out and reapplied to fine linen ground, they are truly masterpieces of the art of applique. The coverlets have never been separated and have passed directly by the descendants to their present vendors. And that's Christie's. And of course, they are just take your breath away. And when you think that she did two of them.
Yes. Don't you want to know how long she worked at those two? I mean, I know that's a question we always ask ourselves, but I just can't even imagine.
Right. And I can't imagine them being locked away. I'm very grateful that they were, and obviously well cared for, because they wouldn't be in such great condition if it wasn't for that. At the auction, there was another person, we don't know who was a higher bidder, and they had the option of taking both quilts for twice what their highest bid was, or taking just one. And they selected what I call the palm tree quilt, because it has 5 palm trees on it. Personally, I would have selected the other one. I don't know why they selected that one. It had previously been published in Avril Colby's book, Quilt Patchwork. Yeah. And so they may have wanted it because it was a published quilt. And but that allowed the Poos collection to then get the other quilt, which has birds, lots of birds. And I always say, if the quilt has a bird in it, it's probably coming home with us.
Well, it's so sad that they're separated, and I just hope that by putting it out here and letting people see it, that maybe someone has an idea who it belongs to, and eventually they'd like to reunite them, because it would be great to see them both together again. So
yes, and that's one of the reasons, even though the original question is, why would I sneak this one out? Well, it's obvious, because I love it. But also I wanted it out there so that other people would be on the lookout for the palm tree quilt. And I would love it if they could be reunited at some point in the future, but at least to know where they are, so that people are aware of her works of art, and that there is more than one is amazing. Once we received the quilt, of course, then we looked at their information that they provided and wanted to do research. And we thought with that much information, we would be able to select which Caroline Danby it was. But Caroline Danby is a very well-known name in their family. And in each generation, there was more than one Caroline Danby, sometimes even more than two Caroline Danbys in the same generation. Even looking at the time constraints on when the quilts could have been made, it didn't narrow it down enough. Now, the other quilt that was published in the book did provide a little bit of information about who owned the quilt at that point. And so we tried to cross-reference that, and those descendants actually moved to Australia, but we still were not able to really solidly narrow it down to one Caroline Danby. And of course, it says it was passed directly by descent, but since she never married and never had children, it couldn't be a direct descendant. And so we couldn't use that line either. It had to have been passed to like a niece or a nephew, which then opened up even more possibilities.
it's maddening, because sometimes that's all you can do is say it's possibly this or possibly that, because with a name that's used over and over again, like they so often did in families, you just can't pinpoint it for sure.
Right. So then we were hoping the address would let us do that. Miss Danby of Parker's Peace, Cambridge.
You would think that.
Wow. Parker's Peace is a 25-acre greens place. There were no buildings on it at that point. This is from a peace party of 1814, and it is a drawing, a rendering of the peace party that took place to celebrate the Treaty of Ghent, which was to end the War of 1812. That date is, of course, important to textile people because of the embargo that had been on fabric, and the English companies had their warehouses full of fabric. Wouldn't you have loved to visit those warehouses?
Yes.
And then they began shipping that fabric over to the US. And so, again, that date is important to us. But it was clear that there's not an apartment building or a residence on this green. It's named Parker after Edward Parker, who was the cook at Trinity College, who originally owned this in the 1600s. And he had leased it from the college. And so that's why it is named for him. Next slide, please. I began to wonder when there were buildings, and these are the first buildings by Parker Peace. They started building it in 1818, but please note, they are still not on Parker's Peace. That is where the European football rules originated, from playing games on that green, and it is still an open green, opened to the public to use, and is now currently owned by the Cambridge, the government. But we do know that there were buildings, and they had apartments, and they had residences in these buildings, which started in 1818. So it could be that is where she worked on it or finished it or kept it. Again, we can't know for sure. One of the Caroline Danbys passed away in 1838. And so I looked to see if there were still buildings there at the Parker's piece, and there are buildings in this rendering of the Queen Victorian coronation celebration that occurred in 1838. So
That's
it is
amazing.
Yeah. Another important date for textile people, as there were lots of Queen Victoria fabrics produced to honor. And we see those in both British and American quilts, so that we can do that.
Your research is fascinating, and I love that you just, delved into every little, hint that you had. And sometimes you get lucky, and sometimes you can just say, this place existed, but it doesn't really help us.
Yeah, I always hope by kind of triangulating the different clues that we can actually reach a more solid answer. But we know her name was Caroline Danby. We know about when she lived based on the fabrics, but we can't say for sure which one it is. And we do know that Parker's piece existed, but as a green, not so much as a...
yeah, maybe it was like a neighborhood once they started building. So
yeah,
quite possibly connected still, though. It's amazing that you found those renderings.
Yeah, I was excited to find that. And these renderings weren't available when we were writing the chintz quilt book. So we probably would have included one or so if we had them available. The Historical Society of Cambridge has now made these available online. And so that's why I was able to access them now.
You never know. Maybe some other clues will come along in the future. So.
And we will be watching. we go back occasionally and follow up on our research, and sometimes we have to update it. And we're always happy to do it to make sure that we have whatever accurate.
That's such a good reminder, because we do that as well with our genealogical task force. Our volunteers call themselves the GTF. Oh. And we do about every 5 years, they'll go back and they'll kind of relook some of these things because so much more information has come out. So your research can really change with just the addition of all these digital sites.
Yes, and there's always more to build on. Even someone who left a body of research, then more information is available, and then you might be able to build on that person's research later. Yeah. So I think it's probably time to go back to the quilt. I say quilt, it's technically a coverlet. And it is a thing of beauty to really admire, looking at it as a whole piece and admiring how much work went into each little detail on it. But it's also important to kind of break it down and see what can we learn from the fabrics that are within the quilt itself, and how does that help us with maybe dating. In the center is the peasant and palm tree fabric.
Lori, can I just stop you for a quick second? Because you made a point, you said it's not a quilt, it's a coverlet. And can you explain the difference between those and how you're referencing that so that everyone understands?
A quilt, we think of having 3 layers, and one usually involves batting. The batting can be another sheet, and then it has quilted details added to it after it has the 3 layers, a backing, a batting, and then the top. And then it has quilted details within it, where we see maybe a grid quilting or elbow quilting. A coverlet is not necessarily that way. And in this case, it's a knife edge binding on it. And so it doesn't have to have any quilting whatsoever. And it can just be the back and the front, or sometimes you will still see the front visible, but it's a finished edge for it to be considered a coverlet.
That's how we use that description as well too, but I think that's good for people to know. So let's get back to the chintz now.
All right. So we're looking at the pheasant and palm tree, which was produced by Bannister Hall. That was the main of the second quilt. That was the main focus, is it had 5 of those images, fabrics contained in it. This fabric is produced in 11 different colorways, and we usually cite it as being circa 1815. But I would warn you that depending on what colorway you have, it depends on when it was produced. It isn't like we produce fabrics today where it all comes out and it may have multiple colorways the year that it came out. Sometimes the different colorways are later, and it wasn't just produced 1 year. It was produced for multiple years. Sometimes it will be produced for 30, 50 years. One of the eagle fabrics that we looked at was reproduced for almost 100 years.
Wow.
In different forms.
Wow,
So,
another really good point.
be aware of that when you're looking at it, and as you try and date quilts from a specific, if you're trying to do it from a single fabric, you really have to be aware of the date range of those fabrics.
Wow.
And I thought we should talk about Bannister Hall a little bit. It was founded in 1798 by Richard Jackson and John Stevenson. It's located near Preston, Lancashire, and was the leading print works for the woodblock furniture chintzes during that period. In 1804, Jackson and Stevenson would bring in Charles Swanson into the company. I don't know the specific reason, but it does appear for some additional financial backing. It is an expensive industry, and it's difficult to make money in this industry. And so it was helpful to have another backer. Between 1809 and it became owned by Charles Swanson. And it was owned by him longer, but in 1825, he switched the name of the company to Charles Swanson and Company. And so that's another detail, again, when you're choosing to identify the fabrics. If you know you have one of the color ways or the backgrounds that was printed at a later date, if you are more specific, you might want to reference it as Charles Swanson and Company.
I'm writing that down, Lori, right now, so I can make sure our database is correct, because I do think we referenced Bannister Hall in some of our later fabrics, and
absolutely,
evidently that's not correct.
Not always, no. And in fact, there's 4 other formations that this company continues to go through before it is sold as a whole, much later in the 19th century. We see this with a lot of fabric companies. Bromley Hall also went through the same thing. Tallwin Foster, they have a whole series too. So we really just need to be aware of that again as we're looking at it and trying to be as accurate as possible given the parameters. So, and I would suggest Linda Eaton's book that she updated for Winterthur on this particular fabric. She discusses some of the different colorways and the years they were produced, which can help you again with your dating and your decisions.
Great.
So let's go to our next slide. And this is the peacock and peahen fabric. I love this fabric, and several of us have very fond of it and wish we could reproduce it. And we talk about it, but it would be a very difficult fabric. I will tell you that I have looked and looked to find this exact fabric. And if we go to the next slide, in another quilt that was in the Chintz Quilts book and now lives at IQM, Peacock and Peahen with hexagon borders, there is a center medallion. And in that center, we see the peacock and peahen in the original fabric. So we can see what surrounded them, the tree, sort of dead tree stump that exists, and that is the original fabric. I've never been able to find a larger version of this fabric to be able to see if I can track who it is. Peacocks were a dominant feature of fabric, starting with in the 1750s, we see early peacock fabric. And as a fabric manufacturer would go out of business, other people would buy their plates and use them. And so, or they would use them for inspiration and create their own. And so there's many different peacock versions out there that have some similarities, but so far I have not found one that matches this exactly.
It's so lovely to see that. I like the way that, standing on the branches like that together.
Yes. And so if anyone knows where there is more of this fabric, please let me know. I'd love to learn more about it. I do know I have other quilts listed that these peacock and peahen occur in. And one is an unquilted counterpane at Shelburne. Another is a quilt by Isabel Hall at the Winterthur Museum. And there's a Mary Firth coverlet at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And last night, I added another one to the list, and that is the Burgess quilt at the Charleston Museum. And it has a date on it that is stitched into it of 1833. I had seen this quilt before, but when I was working on it, I wasn't working on tracking the peacock fabric. So it didn't really connect. Bev Bernard had posted a picture of it as she was remembering her trip to Charleston. And I reposted that on my Facebook page. So if you want to see it, it is also applique though. And so it does not give us more of the fabric itself.
That's exciting to find another one though, and especially a dated one. That's
yes,
great.
I will keep looking for more. It also shows how the English quilts have the earlier dates on it because they had access to the fabric first, and the American quilts tend to have the later dates on it, 1820 to 46, as late as 46, so that we can see that the fabrics are. Perhaps came over in the big fabric dump. We don't know exactly, but we do know that we tend to get our fabrics maybe 10 years. In some cases, we start seeing them about 10 years behind the original use in England. And the next slide. So I thought we should take a look at some of the other details that are in this beautiful quilt. And again, recognize that we are getting closer and we are getting close-ups, and you'll still notice that stitches are not apparent because of her skill level.
And look at those tiny, tiny stems she appliqued. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's it's a difficult
yes,
very difficult to do that narrow. So we appreciate it. Of course, I highlighted the birds because in our famous fabrics that we tracked in the book, you will notice that a lot of them had birds. And we do love the birds. But we also try and keep track of some of the flowers. I have some tulip fabric that I was tracking for a long time. That is, the reproduction is known as Anne Varley, but these are different tulips that we see there. And in the other slide, we see that beautiful blue flower, and that appears in another Bannister Hall fabric. So we know that Caroline Danby used more than one Bannister Hall fabric. And so it's interesting to note that they weren't all from one fabric.
And these colors are still so beautiful and so vibrant. And, like I said, it's sad that the quilts didn't see much light, but we are very fortunate to have such great examples because of that.
Yeah, and it really lets us know that the bright colors were there. Sometimes we're used to seeing it tinged with brown, or as the fabric has aged, the fugitive colors have changed even more to a different color. And so it's really helpful to be able to see the additional colors and their original, as close to possible, original state.
Mm-hmm.
So now I thought I'd also highlight a couple of others things in there. And here we have a couple of more birds as well as some butterflies. We have kind of a silly bird who's trying to flap, but he's attached to a stick. And look at those twig legs. Sometimes
I can't.
Sometimes we will embroider the legs of a bird on so that they have legs, but she did not. She appliqued those delicate little legs on there, and where there were spaces, she added. Besides the flowers, she would add butterflies. And again, notice some of the very small circles of the buds and stems that she used. We also have.
She loved this. She was having so much fun.
She was.
You can just see how much she loved filling that space and putting it together and lavishing time on it. It's amazing.
And it's to me, it's amazing. I also selected these two because you can see there's a couple of what is perhaps the largest white spaces on there, just to give you an idea of how tightly she was adding these different images and just continued to add. And I don't know if she, we have no way of knowing if she laid it out beforehand or put some in and then just kept adding along. I only know that it's just a masterpiece that we see. And in the other image, we have a couple of almost a blue jays. I've never seen a blue jay with the pink wings, but it makes them more colorful and fun. And so I'm thrilled to have them. Again, we see some very small stems in there, as well as the details of the points on the flowers and going ahead and cutting those points in between the petals to make sure that the flowers are accurately, no skipping a little bit over for her,
And you often see that with other quilts, especially if it had a white ground and they knew it might not be seen. They would just kind of leave it in those really narrow areas so they didn't have to do the applique so finely. But not Caroline.
No, she was an artist and clearly a skillful needlewoman who reflected her artistry.
Yes, she did.
And the next one that we have are vases. These are a couple of different vase fabrics. They appear in one of the inner borders as well as within the center body of the quilt. I have hunted for these vase fabrics. There are multiple vase fabrics that were created. I did find a vase fabric in the V&A that someone had probably used for cutout chintz because there were subjects that were cut around and they just had the scrap left. They use all the same colors, but without actually having one of those vases within that fabric. There was no way for me to say, oh, yes, this is where it came from. But a real acknowledgement of how important the chintz fabric was, that a scrap would be saved and is still preserved in one of the preeminent museums in the world. And when you prorate fabric to allow for the current state, chintz fabric would run over $200, about $225 a yard. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
We knew it was expensive, but I didn't realize it was that pricey. Wow.
Yeah. So if we were like buying it today at the same rate that they would have bought it, it would have been about $225. And I think, I complain about $15 a yard fabric. No.
Well, I think that's why these were really women's masterpieces, because they just were expensive to make and they took a lot of time. So you really had to be a woman of some means to be able to afford something like this, obviously.
And it's why we see lots of scraps preserved. In the Poos collection, there is some chintz that is a single patch that is just one patch stitched together, and it's not very big, but they framed it. And so, you know, they were the owners of some chintz fabric, and they framed that, put it in a beautiful gold fabric, gold frame. They framed it and preserved it because it was valuable. And when some of the ladies would pass on the scraps of their fabric to others, that was quite a gift during that period.
Well, you know, we have a Queen Victoria print in one of our quilts, as you mentioned, her coronation print. And interestingly, we have another quilt by the family that was made 12 years later, and they centered the quilt around Queen Victoria again. So it just shows that they held onto that fabric and prized it. And when one of the family members came to visit, used it for her block for that quilt, and had held on to it for that long. Which, when you think about it, we do kind of hold on to fabric, don't we? That we
Yes, we do.
We do.
I've also noticed in these northern chintz quilts that I am studying that sometimes they would cut out part of the design and use that in the center block, but then the corners that they cut the basket of flowers out of that had little corners trim on it, that they will actually save those corners and use those in a different block. And maybe they'll put a butterfly in the center, or maybe they only have those 4 corners appliqued on so that they can go ahead and write their inscription or their signatures information within that block. But chintz fabric was not wasted. It was every inch of it was saved and put to use. Sometimes even the ground fabric, the background, would be used if there was a section that was pieced. They would use that in their piecing. And we have a quilt in the Poos collection where she actually used the background and matched it, lined it up and stitched it together because she didn't have enough for the size of the half square triangle. And so she stitched it, matched that fabric, and then used it. And again, a really skilled needlewoman that unless you were really examining the quilt, you wouldn't be able to see that is what she had done.
And those tiny, tiny stitches that they used, I mean, you could really create just a seamless print by using those 2 pieces when you're doing those tiny, tiny stitches.
Yeah. And when it was, you know, it had a little bit of stripe in it, for her to be able to match those stripes up was very detail oriented.
It is kind of crazy. Let me just ask you this random question, Lori. If these quilts come with the white background, they come with the chintz printed on them with all these beautiful florals around them, why do you think they cut them out and reapplied them in a different way?
Well, I think they treasured, I mean, one theory is that they just treasured different parts of the fabric. And it was their way of creating their own masterpiece, not what the particular fabric manufacturer created. Even today, when we're working on our quilts, there's certain things in the fabric we like. For example, I like birds. So I'm going to cut out every bird that's in all of the fabric. And I might not include the other parts of the fabric, but I might use them later in another quilt or another block.
And when you look at Carolyn's, she really reduced the amount of white space. So maybe she just wanted that just completely full that way. But
yeah, you do wonder. I mean, some of the fabrics would have had a lot more white space on it than she allowed in hers. And you can really see how balanced she was when you look at the 4 male peacocks are in the corners, but there's 4 female peahens that balance out the different areas in there, all surrounding that pheasant in the palm tree, which was an important fabric to her for some reason.
Yeah. And she really did a symmetrical patterning when you look at like on the right down the middle, the outer edge, the 2 gold flowers, then the 2 peahens, and then it's just incredibly balanced.
Yeah, and she continued when she worked onto the next border. outside. So she's got her center where she has balanced she's got the peahen and then the 2 blue flowers and then the 2 pink flowers. And you can just follow all the way across, and you can follow up and down. The vases are in the 4 corners, which are cut off just a little bit, and this trying to get a little closer look for us. Great, thank you. And when you look at these, you can see she's got vases in the, thank you, Tara. She's got vases in the 4 corners of the center areas, and then she has vases in the next border, in the corners of the next border that comes out. And again, she has balanced her flowers carefully on each side and top and bottom, and she's put vases in the center of each of the border as well.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and they're not all the same vase. So that's why I showed the 2 different vases, because she has used the 4 corners are one style of vase, and then in the middle of the borders, you find the different vase that she has shown there. Yep, right there. So that we can.
It's just incredible. And you know, and of course, at that time, you know, the expectation of a woman with some means and the ability to do this time is that you would show off your skills and you would create something that was truly your own. So she really did do an amazing job with 2 of these beautiful
pieces. And to think that after she completed one, she then started another masterpiece. For me, I look at this and I think, one. If I would have made it through one, I would have accomplished, you know, something, let alone to create 2. Not to mention that she had to have been a woman who could afford to purchase all of these fabrics and cut them out in the way that she wanted. And so some of the fabric would not have been used with the differences then. And so we really see how much time and incredible skill went into these different ones.
Well, Lori, I know you've studied so much, and I do want to touch on some of the research you're doing today on some American chintz, but when I look at this, it has that kind of feel of British quilt making, because it's just a big, large piece. It's full. I think we see a lot more block format in the U.S. So she probably is following some regional styles as well, and that's something that you're going to talk about. Before we go to that topic, though, Julie Silver has a question that any chance that she had help from family or friends or household help. But I would imagine a woman of means that could buy a $200 a yard fabric probably had servants taking care of, if not the quilt, maybe not helping with the quilt, we don't know, possibly helping with the quilt, but she certainly had household help.
Yeah, I would think she had household help. I don't actually know. As I mentioned, we couldn't narrow it down to which specific Caroline Danby or Caroline Danby it was. When you look at the stitch work on there, because you can't see the stitch work, there's not much variance on it. Whereas sometimes when a quilt is assembled by a group of workers or a group of people, you will see a variance in how it is applied and made. And so I kind of question whether this was done by a group. But she also could have been the one that designed it and didn't stitch it. We do have the family's provenance of saying it was made by her. But that is
we never can know for sure.
No, we can't know, especially since we can't track down the specific one or find a journal or diary which says, today I worked on adding 5 peacocks.
Darn it. I wish we knew. Yeah.
I doubt she would have gotten 5 done in one day, but you know.
Yeah. you know, but a woman who spent this much time on needlework and did such a good job, you know, there's a great variation between how fast people can work. And some people can work really quickly, and some people are going to just take a much longer time to do it. So that's another factor we can't know is really how, I mean, you could imagine she had someone cut the pieces out for her so she could do the sewing or something, but
Well, and we don't know what age she was when she was working on them, or how long over a span, did she work on it, during the day, or just for a couple of hours, or was this something that really occupied her time and was something that she wanted to spend a long time each day working on? We just don't know.
yeah. Well, and she didn't have children, and as Tara said, she didn't have Netflix.
Yes,
yeah.
she didn't have children, and that would have perhaps freed up some more time for her.
Are you able to see, I believe these are backed, but are you able to get any sense if there's any seams, if she did it all in one large piece, or if she broke it down into sections?
They are backed, so I don't know if she broke it down into sections or not. There are folds, but there don't seem to be seams at the folds.
I don't remember seeing seam lines in it at all.
And so certainly the borders could have been added, and done separately, but that center piece,
So she must have had a pretty good sized space to work in, and she probably didn't have a dog that on the floor that she would sew into the quilt like some people do.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Lori, I do want to talk a little bit, because I want everybody to have a chance to know about the research you're doing on fabrics and how they can help or how they can learn more. So at your study session at seminar, you talked about looking at North versus South regional styles. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, and tell us a little bit more about that piece behind you?
Okay. Well, one of the things that we look at is how a quilt is maybe assembled. For example, this quilt is assembled in what some people would call a British frame style. It has a big center medallion, and then it has frames that go out from it. And the knife edge is also something that's associated with a British quilt or an English quilt. Now, that doesn't mean that it's accurate 100% of the time, but it is some guidelines that you can consider. I began noticing that there was a center medallion style of chintz applique in the US, and people seem to be comfortable referring to it as more of a Southern style quilt. And I decided I was going to start tracking that and take a look at it, and was really amazed at how many, if you look at the Charleston Museum or some of the other Southern museums, you will see a large collection of these center medallion applique quilts that have a large center motif and then may work their way out. But I was aware of some quilts that appeared to be from Philadelphia, which is what first started me. As I noticed a quilt in the Los Angeles County Museum that had 8-inch blocks of chintz applique, and a lot of them. And then it had a center reef with a dedication. And then one day I noticed that in the Philadelphia Museum, there was another quilt that looked almost exactly like it. And so I have 2 screens, and I put one on each screen and just started looking at the 2 quilts. Well, then all of a sudden I found a third quilt like that. And from your earlier chintz research that you found multiple quilts that were similar in style. And I continue to look at these quilts and have now located more than 20 of these quilts with that particular style that appear to come from the northern area of the United States. Some of the fabrics are the same. Mm-hmm. And so I began to track the fabrics and really counted in the dahlia block, which is a famous block, I counted 72 dahlia blocks in those. Now, the dahlia block was not diagnostic because we do also see that in Southern quilts too. But I began to see that there were some fabrics that you could see in both the Southern quilts and Northern quilts, but then there were a number of fabrics that were only available in the Northern quilts. And I really began to use that as a diagnostic for that type of quilt. I'm continuing to research this. If you go to our website, you can go to Pinterest or go to our Facebook. You can click on a link and it says Northern style chintz applique quilts. If you know of any that aren't on there, please send me images, contact me. I'm continuing to build this body of work. I'm continuing to track them back to workshops. I currently have about 8 workshops where there were a group of ladies that continued to make these quilts together and use them as fundraisers, as memorials, as gifts to a pastor that was departing, various reasons. And I really want to be able to document those more in detail.
Well, we know that, it was really a big thing in the 1840s, particularly for these, as you said, workshops developed, and a lot of them affiliated with churches, where the women would all work on individual blocks. And then maybe one member, in my research, I found writing that said one member of the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia was the woman who actually put the blocks together. She probably did the quilting too. I don't know that for sure, but it was really a huge phenomenon. In fact, in the church, the First Baptist Church writings, they actually called it an institution. So they were doing it for probably 10 or 12 years, sometimes as gifts and sometimes as fundraisers. So I think it's really fascinating that what we're finding so often now are kind of central locations like Philadelphia, a big city like the churches, where these regional styles are really developing. And are you seeing that in your research then, that they're regional styles?
They are regional styles. And if you think about it, at the same time in Baltimore is when we see the Baltimore album quilts. And that was their particular style that was developing. Do you find a few in isolated other areas? Oh, sure, that somebody may have moved or they were inspired by it. And the same is true. This so far seems to have developed in Philadelphia and then worked its way out to other areas. But again, that's kind of a preliminary theory as we continue to develop, looking where they are located and how many were made with each workshop within the area that we can do. And there's still a lot of documentation yet to do on that as well.
I just want, there's a couple questions. Lisa said, have we found chintz applique quilts with names and locations from both North and South? And I know we definitely have both in our collection, and I'm sure you've seen that they're a little bit different. I think you talked about size of blocks and overall format in your study session, but that, yes, there definitely are both types.
Yeah, you do see both. You tend to see larger blocks in the Southern quilts. If they have blocks, sometimes they'll still be the center medallion format and still have signatures on them or memorials too. But you do see both in Southern and Northern. But the Southern tends to be a larger size block, 12 inches and up. The Northern tends to be 12 inches and down.
Have you looked at whether the blocks are on point? Because as I'm thinking here, I'm thinking, gosh, a lot of our Southern quilts, I think they put the blocks on point rather than straight. I don't know if that's a fact or not, but maybe something.
Yeah, initially, I thought it might be a factor, and also setting strips, but we found it related more to the workshop. Some of the ladies in one church seemed to want them on point, and they always use setting strips, whereas some of the other groups never use setting strips and never put them on point.
Well, we have, we're getting so close to time, but we have another question. Can you talk about London versus Yorkshire printers?
Okay. So London and Yorkshire printers, or Lancashire. And what happens is that in the 1700s, we see London had been primarily the dominant fabric manufacturing. They may produce their fabrics outside of London, but they were for the London sellers and to be distributed from London. But there began to be fabric manufacturers in other locations, Lancashire and Yorkshire, and they began to sell to the US as well, besides the London, and began competing with each other. And one of the research details is that the northern quilts that were smaller in scale, analysis of the sales records by Peter Maw, don't want to take credit for his work, he noticed that there was really a rise in the almost 75 to 80% of the Philadelphia and New York fabrics were being purchased from producers outside of London, whereas the Baltimore and Charleston ports were the fabrics were coming from London.
Interesting. Wow.
So the scale is different.
That's amazing research. And I think we're always so curious about where fabric comes. So I'm hoping that you're going to have lots more for us. Before we run out of time, though, tell us about the quilt behind you.
Well, this is the start of a Northern style quilt. So while I was researching this, a dear friend, Cynthia Collier, who unfortunately passed away in June of this year, she loved and was a brilliant applique artist, and she loved chintz applique. And when I wrote my first blog about this, she said, "Are there more? Are there more?" And I sent her this email with a whole, list of links. And she actually started a chintz applique quilt in this style, and she kept trying to motivate me to do it as well. And so I have decided we're going to do it. And so this is the start of mine. I have a center medallion that's the reproduction from one of the quilts, one of the actual quilts. It's Mexican shellflower and calla lily. And then I'm putting 6-inch blocks around it. Some of these quilts have as many as 156 blocks in them. I'm not saying I'm going to go that far. And they were usually made to honor somebody. So I am now honoring Cynthia Collier with mine. And I am inviting everyone to join the fun and to create a Northern style chintz applique quilt. And we have a Facebook page where we're working together on it. Feel free to email me or contact me through the website if you want to join. You can use your stash. You can get some of the exact fabrics that were used in the original quilts if you want, but just join the fun.
Oh, well, what a lovely memory for your friend. I think that's really wonderful.
Yes.
Julie Silver just made a comment. It's interesting how this style of free-floating applique may well relate to quilts made a bit later in England, in the type the English call naive applique, made from much less pricey quilts, but similar in the quilt surface is covered in applique figures, sometimes representational figures, sometimes abstract. It is interesting that there was a tradition in Britain, not as maybe widespread as in the US, right, but that they definitely had a tradition. And I like that free floating applique as a description.
Yes.
Wow. Well, Julie, next time we're going to have to just do a talk on chintz quilts and have you join us, because you obviously got a lot of knowledge as well. But oh my gosh, Lori, our time is up. I think your research is just so amazing, and I'm just delighted that you're out there getting this done. And I sent my dissertation chapters. Anybody else who wants to share a chintz quilt with Lori, I'm sure she'd love to know. We have a new one on the way, Lori, from 1847 that I haven't seen the whole quilt yet, but I'll have to get that to you.
Oh,
Please
please.
share your research with Lori, because that's what it really takes, is all of these quilts coming together, because they tell so much more about what they are all individually about when we can see them as a group.
No.
So,
And thank you for having me.
well, thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. We will look forward to more research and more topics through AQSG. If you want to see more chintz quilts, I believe you can see the Poos collection on our website under our searchable database, and you can see all the collection, all those quilts that came with that particular group. So thanks so much, everybody, for being with us today. Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Tara and Lisa, for all your work behind the scenes. Bye, everybody.
Bye.